Hey there everybody, it's Nathan Cool with NathanCoolPhoto.com. I'm standing all the way over here because we're going to be shooting a very large 360 pano of the space using a DSLR and not using flash. Now that will be the next step. If you know from my latest book, which is a virtual tour photography for real estate, I've got a link to that by the way in the description for this video. This is the next step compared to the last video that I covered where we went outside without using flash, not doing HDR, just taking one ambient shot of our 4 around, 1 up, and we stitch that together and we get ourselves a really good looking 360-degree virtual tour. So this is the next step before moving on to flash, which will be an upcoming video where then we can do window pulls for getting those crisp, clear views outside, striking colors, all the things that you would expect from using flash photography. This though is the intermediate step. So if you haven't done yet your calibration, that's 2 videos ago, also practicing outside to come up with your first DSLR 360 virtual tour, that's 1 video ago, and now this is the intermediate step before we get into flash. So this isn't just for practice though, by the way, and I talk about this in the book, is that there's still a good quality for and use then for this camera just using nothing but ambient shots. And by the way, yes, if you did want to skip flash and do HDR, you can do that. PT GUI Pro, for instance, does require HDR, but I'm staying away from that. I get a much better quality by using flash. That will be the upcoming video. But here though, it's a very simple technique for doing this, but the reasons for it are a little bit more than just, hey, let's get some practice out of this. So at the end of this video, I'm going to compare what we're going to do here real quick up against using the Ricoh Theta Z1. Apple to apple comparison, it's going to be a single exposure that's used for the footage here, and then a single exposure out of the Ricoh Theta Z1. You can start seeing then some differences. So we're not going to get the clear views to the outside. You can see even through filming this that it's going to be blown out. So my views out of my house, which by the way, this is where this is. It's a great lab to practice in. We're not going to be able to get those clear views outside doing this technique, but the difference will be a lot different than what we'll see out of the Theta Z1. So stay tuned near the end of the video for that. So anyways, this though is a deliverable product. You are going to have a very good high quality image that you can then process out of this compared to using a portable camera, but it can be a little bit more cumbersome. So that's why it's good to try this no matter what. To make things simple for this, I'm not going to be using the trigger setup. So just like I showed on the last video, we're going to be using the self timer on this to take these shots. It's going to be very simple, but I'm going to walk through the entire process of how do I then figure out what exposure I'm using. On the last video when we went outside, it was very simple. It's an outside exposure. I used my go-to settings when I covered that in that last video. Here though, we have to determine that, and we also have to think about composition, because when we move to the next step and we have to worry about windows, we want to make sure that we're properly aligned and we really get a good composition for that. Besides the other room compositions like I talk about in the book, where we want to have not necessarily in the center of a room, we might want to have ourselves just a little bit farther in. The important composition when it comes to shooting with the flash is to making sure that we optimize the footage for the window pulls so that we're not doing window pulls on every single turnaround because we've got overlap. So those are some things we'll cover in the next video. Right now though, on this video, let's get started on how this is done. So I'm going to go ahead and step back here, and of course then you'll see some other stuff, closer images here to show some of the details. So like before, we're going to start at position 0 on this. I can move this maybe a little bit here. We can see a little bit more what's going on. So the first thing I try to do is to see what type of exposure I'm shooting at. Now, this is going to be very similar to anything else that you shoot for real estate photography, doing your standard stuff. So you're going to be used to seeing, well, I kind of know this room might need 1/10 of a second, 15th of a second. If you're using that standard f7.1, ISO 320 that I talk about throughout the interiors book and other videos as well. So I've got this turned on right now, and what I'm going to do is just start taking some shots, and I've got the self timer on, so I hit it, step back, click, and there I can see what's going on. So I start looking at the histogram. I can see that it's kind of low once I started into this, and it's like, yeah, I might want to up that a little bit, but let's take a look at the rest of the room. One thing you can't see behind the camera, but you're going to see when I then do this picture here, And let me just get this all the way turned around. It was starting to come off my head there, something I talk about in the book as well. So I'm going to bring it out here to the 270 position and go ahead and do a self-timer, click it, just see how that image looks. And it's a little bit on the hot side when we take a look at the histogram, but not bad. It's because of those windows, those picture windows that are way up at the top. And yeah, hello, you can see my tripod way over there. It's filming me right now. Or I should say recording in today's day and age. You can tell how old I am by saying filming. Anyways, so that's good. I'll take a look around maybe some other positions here, like I'll look into the dining room and see what that exposure is looking like. So this is just test footage. It's not stuff we're going to use, so I got a trick to know what to use. Now that's not so bad. I'm actually seeing some outside exposure, but it's not enough to really make it worthwhile to sacrifice maybe some of the other stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that exposure. I'm going to set myself back up here. I'm going to go back to 0 degrees. And that's where we always want to start at. And I've got this set right now to about a 30th of a second. I'm going to try, let's say, about a 20th of a second, just real quick, and just test this and see what the histogram looks like on this spot, which is kind of overlapping between those two rooms. That's not too bad. And then I'll just take a look one more time. I'll just loosen these up a bit so I can actually rotate it easier this way. There. And now I'll go ahead and do that real quick, just see what that looks like. So this is all just test footage once again. Yeah, that's on the hot side. Maybe that could tone down a little bit. So we'll go for something in between. So long drawn out story. This is then how I would test for what exposure. So the exposure I'm using here, which we're after 4 o'clock in the afternoon here on a July day in Southern California, a lot of sun is streaming in through my house, and there's a lot of light gray colors. The flooring's light, so there's a lot of light that's reflecting off everything. So I'm at ISO 320, f7.1, and 1/25th of a second. Now that I'm ready to shoot our footage, this is going to go real quick, but to make sure that I'm exactly where I want to be in post-processing, I do this little trick. So I've set myself up once again. I'm starting at 0 position, but I flag where I'm supposed to be, and I put my hand out there and I do something. Now that was for take 2. So if I was doing this over and it's like, oh, I forgot something, I do take 3, take 4, take 5, whatever. And if I really messed up, I would just go out here and do something along those lines. So I have some type of marker to know where in that footage I'm going to start. This is where we begin. So this is our first shot. Once again, 0 degrees on the pano head. So we'll just do that. I'm not using the trigger, just the self timer, and go over here to then 90 degrees is our next position, and I'll go ahead and click the self timer on that, step back, because everything gets caught in these fisheye lenses. Now we'll move to the 180 position. That looks good, and I'll just go ahead and fire that off. Okay, now let's go to 270. Right there. That's 270, okay? And I'll step back out of the way. And now for the fun part, we're gonna shoot the zenith real easy. Once again, I like to bring myself back to 0 degrees. You don't have to necessarily, but tighten this up now just a little bit. But it's one of those things I prefer because then I know where I am on my next shot. Okay, so getting out of the way here because this catches everything. So self timer, boom, and there we go. Okay, there's our zenith. So we're all done taking this footage. Now, if I was doing this for flash, once again, I wouldn't be using that self timer. So it's easy enough to do though when you're doing ambient shots, and it's a very simple setup. And it's a great way to get your feet wet by getting yourself a pano head. You probably have a DSLR. You could try just about any lens, but once again, the lenses that I recommend in the book, like these fisheye lenses, do work the best. And that's what I do recommend to go forward with. Anyways, we've got our footage. It's now time to stitch this together. It's going to be similar to what we did last time, but we're going to be doing some stuff you may be familiar with when it comes to interior photography, using, for instance, like the light bumper, full bump. We're going to see about that when we get into Lightroom, or Lightroom adjustments, I should say, in post-processing and Photoshop. And also stay tuned because I'm going to be taking another shot with this with the Ricoh Theta Z1. Once again, just a single exposure being similar to what we did here, and we'll be able to compare those two. All right, so now we've got these 5 shots that we've taken, and we can do the same similar process as we did in the last video when we were outside, but it's going to be just a little bit different in our post-processing. But once again, we want to drag these over into PT GUI. So I've got PT GUI open over here, and that's just the typical project assistant screen, just like I showed before. It's a very simple 3-step process. You just grab these images. Now this happens to be just View NXI. You could use just about any program to drag these in, or load images by hitting their load images button. But I'm going to select all of those and just drag those on over here. That's great. And then I just click align images. Boom, there's our pano. Now, there's a couple small problems here, and this is something that you will sometimes face using a DSLR mirrorless camera for making these panoramas, and that's known as a stitching error. So there's a couple things here. Let me just zoom in here real quick. I'm going to use the detail viewer up here, and that gets me in really close. And I know where these are. They're up here at the top. I saw, but it's kind of hard to see on the screen. So let me just get to those real quick, and you can see up here, boom. That is a stitching error. And you can see that there was a little bit of an issue here. That's a super easy thing to fix in post-processing. This is something you rarely come across when you're dealing with the portable cameras, since you know, you don't have to worry so much about the lens position. It's always in the same place. Where here we've got more panos that we have to, images to put together in a pano. To see a little bit more on this, just what's behind the scenes on this, up here in the panorama editor for the in PTGUI, you click this one here to show seams. So this shows all the seams of where those images were put together. If you want to see the numbers, you just click on this little number button here and they go on and off. And so it's a little bit hard to see here. Number 5, little numbers hidden way up here in the top, but I can see that over here, this section of the dining room is image 2, this was image 1, and so that little section here where we had the detail error, that's some type of a cross section between images 2, images 1, images 5. Now there's different things we can do to correct that in PTGUI. To me, it's just not worth the time. We're still going to have a much better quality pano. Nobody's really going to care about that stitching area, and it's a super easy thing to fix in Photoshop anyways. So anyways, that's just a little bit more detail of some stuff I'll be covering down the road. In the book, I talk about control points and some other things you can do to possibly improve this, but it's still not bad. So this looks like a good pano. So once again, just like before, I'm just going to close these other windows out of PTGUI and just go to create panorama. It's going to default to this particular directory, this file name. To me, that's fine for right now for what we're doing. And I'm outputting as a 16-bit TIFF. You can see it's TIFF over here. It's a 16-bit selected here. And I'm just going to create the panorama. And that's really all there is to it. Now our panorama is made. So it's all stitched, and now we have a TIFF file. So now we go over to Photoshop, and we're going to load that TIFF. And there it is. All right, now we do have a problem with the nadir, or however you want to pronounce it. As I talk about in the book, there's more than one way to pronounce this. But we're going to do some very simple stuff that you're probably very familiar with. First off, we can see if we zoom in here that we've got some pretty good clarity, not too bad. Things look a little bit soft because we haven't done any sharpening yet. When these things, once again, I used TIFFs. You could have used raw files, but I didn't do any processing on that. And still not too bad around the windows. The lens did a pretty good job on this and the camera. So anyways, let's post-process this. It would be just about like doing any other interior job. So I'm going to duplicate this layer by doing Control-J. That allows me then to go back and do just non-destructive work. Now what I'll do is I'll use the camera raw filter. Now this in Photoshop, if you're not familiar with it, is almost exactly like Lightroom. So you can see all the common adjustments are here. If you were to go over here, here's for instance the detail amount, but most importantly is here's where our presets are. So I have a preset that I would use as my light bump, and it would be sharpening also, but with no vertical adjustment. So let's start with that one and just apply that preset. We can see that in the detail sharpening, it did some with some masking. So now if we zoom in here 100%, take a look for instance at the piano here, we can see that it looks very good, very sharp. So not a problem there at 100%. Things are looking good. So we'll zoom out here a little bit here on camera raw filter and see what else we might want to change. So our histogram, not looking too bad. We might want to bump that up just a little bit. So maybe we'll increase the highlights just a little bit. We could always increase the exposure a little bit. But if we do that, we're going to blow out this area. So there's another way to get around doing that. We're going to do another layer here shortly. But most importantly, does the white balance look good? Do our colors look okay? I'd say this would probably go a little bit cooler. So we'll just tone down that white balance just a little bit. Not bad. So let's just say right about there is where we want it. And whatever adjustments we wanted to make, we just then click OK. So doing that, it takes a little while. Boom. So now this is what it was before. Now we've got this. So now we've got a sharper looking image. We zoom in here to some of my artwork that's on the dining room wall here, and we can see that it's definitely a lot sharper. Colors are looking good. Now, the dining room is a little underexposed. It needs a little bit more oomph. Now, once again, we're working in TIFFs from raw files. This is lossless compression. So let's add another layer. Let's take this layer and do Control J. Now let's go up here to our camera raw filter. Select it again, and this time let's bump up some shadows and white. So we'll bump up some shadows and keep an eye on the dining room and bump up the whites. If we wanted to, we could even up the exposure just a tad if we wanted to, and we'll just click OK. Now we only want it in that area, so we'll just do that with the layer mask. We'll go Layer Mask Hide, then we'll take a brush at, let's say, 100% flow to just do this real quick, and then we'll just add that in there. Boom. So now we're able to lighten that area. Now, once again, and I just lowered the flow of the brush just a little bit to help blend that in. If we go in here 100%, even though we were upping shadows and upping white, we're still not getting any noise. So this is looking really good. Once again, shooting with the DSLR gives you these advantages. So that's not looking too bad on what we're doing. If we wanted to even add a little bit more brightness to everything, what we can do is add an adjustment layer. So Layer, Adjustment Layer, Brightness. Call it whatever. We'll put it all the way at the top, and we'll add some more brightness. And now we can see the histogram moving over to where we want it, kind of right of center. Now it really did brighten up a lot of stuff, and over here we really don't want it that bright. There's my tripod, hello. So we want to remove it from there, so we just take an eraser tool and on the mask, and we just start erasing some of that brightness. So these are all the things that you would normally do with, for instance, brushes in Lightroom, but Photoshop gives you this flexibility. We'll get rid of some of the brightness over here on the floor too and looking outside, but everything else looks pretty good. So this is what we started with out of PT GUI, and this is now where we are. Now we'll just add a quick nadir patch, and that's just the way that I do it, like I show in the book. The very simplest way. There's a couple ways I show, but we'll just go with a new layer, and we'll just call him whatever. We'll use our default colors, a paint bucket, and make that layer all black. And then we'll just scale it down so that it covers that region right there. Boom. Okay, that looks good. Now you could save this any way that you want, but what I'm going to do is we need to flatten it, but I also know this came out of a Nikon camera and they got their own sRGB, so another way that I do it is I do a convert to profile, which then changes it to the standard sRGB, and that also flattens it. So boom, there we are. Then the last step is just to save it as a JPEG. So we'll go Save As, and then we'll save this as a JPEG, and we'll call this one DSLR.jpg. And that's all there is to it. So that pano is completely done. So when we take a look at it and start spinning it around, it looks like this. Okay, so the next thing I want to take a look at was when we started comparing this to shooting with the Theta Z1. So these are some exposures that I shot with the Ricoh Theta, and you can see that if this one, I did some editing already, straight out of camera, if I go down here and we go in about 100%, you can see it's very soft. It's going to be very soft around the piano because that happens to be the stitching line. So these cameras are notorious for being very soft at the stitching line, but if we look up here at the windows, they're really blown out just to get one even exposure where it's still the dining room would be okay. So we'd think, well, what we can do is maybe tone down those highlights and we can bring up the shadows. When we do stuff like that, even to get it to something workable that was about this range, we still have some ugliness going on here around the windows. You can't almost get rid of it. If we go in here to, for instance, the dining room window, that's really tough. Look at that glare coming off of there. It's just causing all kinds of stuff on this fisheye lens, weird colors coming off of it. So it's very hard to deal with, and there's still a lot of noise despite the fact that I have the noise reduction up to 37, and I have to bring the sharpening up to 76 on these cameras, otherwise it'd be too soft. If I took that noise reduction down, there's just grain everywhere, so we don't want to do that. Anyways, I have a side-by-side comparison showing both of these. There's a link to that also in the description for this video, but real quick, let's take a look first at what came out of the DSLR and then out of the Theta Z1. that's not all there is to it. A couple things coming up here. One, you might have already seen that we could do a lot better job with the Ricoh Theta Z1 and other portable cameras by doing that exposure blending with luminosity masks. Now I have step-by-step instructions for doing that in a video, a few videos back, and also in the book as well. The other thing too is that we still kind of beat the pants off of the Ricoh Theta Z1 using a DSLR, but there was more work involved with it. Also, we're going to be able to move toward flash, and that'll give us the much better picture for doing it. Also, the Ricoh Theta Z1 goes in places that the DSLR might have a hard time getting into, a small bathroom, whatever. So that's why I talk about in the book that there's different ways to start structuring your packages. So even if I go into houses and I'm using the DSLR for what we call the high-res, high-def package or the impact package, is that we still don't take every single shot with the DSLR. There's just places it just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't necessarily fit. Sometimes hallways aren't necessary to have a DSLR. People are going to be in there as they cruise around as just an intermediate transitional point through their navigation of the virtual tour, so you can spend less time on those scenes. Anyways, upcoming videos we'll do a more direct comparison on doing this with then flash, so you can see then how to incorporate flash into this process using the DSLR for making virtual tours, so you can get window pulls and all that stuff, also covered in the book. But what we will also, if you're interested, if you want to see a real comparison against these two, not just the single exposure, but also then what it would look like between using the luminosity masking with the exposure blending on the Theta Z1, let me know, and I'll put together a quick video on that as well. Anyways, I hope this video is useful for you and that you can use some of this in your photography as well. If you did like this video, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. It won't cost anything, and as soon as one of these videos is posted, you'll be the first to know. Thanks a lot for watching. Until next time, take care, be safe, and get out there and shoot something.